I feel like I first need to address the fact that this set is dressed up here. I have nothing to do with that. I didn't know that I was supposed to talk about amazing wonders tonight. Thanks for making the banner. Whoever did that. No, that's BBS for 22nd Street. Chad said nothing about that when he asked me to fill in for him. He is on the way back from yet another wedding, this time in Albuquerque. And he talked to me and just asked if I would come and kind of. Usually, it's kind of funny, I thought he kind of did this to me with Acts too. He's like, just talk about your journey through the whole thing. And we'd gone through this giant book together, and I was like, whoa. And here we are, most of the way through Exodus, and I'm like, wow, what do I process here in terms of the entire story? And I guess there's some of you who might not know me. My name's Scott, and my day job is an English teacher, so I take a literary bend towards everything. And that's what I kind of did here, and I started to think about, okay, we've read through this story together, and there's a couple things that Chad said last week that allowed me to do what I think will work pretty well. The first thing that he said last week is that it is much easier to believe in something that can be seen and tested, not just trusted. And this connected with a book that I had read earlier by a Christian writer named Flannery O'Connor. She is from the first half of the 1900s. But I read a book by her called Mystery and Manners, and it talked a lot about her philosophy of writing, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that as a writer, you want to push the concrete, the sensory detail, because in the audience that you're writing for, the way that they collect information about their world is through their senses. That is all that we have as humanity. And then when Chad said that about how it's easier to believe in what we can see and test, I thought about how she made this observation about humanity, and that would count all the way back to the Israelites as a nation. Every one of them would have been under that same limit of their senses being what they collect information with about their experience, including the story that we're reading. So as the events, these epic, large-scale events are happening in the story of God, the individual person would be just there, sensing it, feeling what's going on, hearing things, seeing things, and processing that the best they could. We have the chronological advantage of knowing how the story ends. They did not. They were just there. And to avoid what I thought, and I want to tonight help us avoid what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery. And that just is the tendency that we have as people who know how the story goes, to kind of put judgment on those people and say, I can't believe they did this. Didn't they hear God? Didn't they see what he did? And I just want to kind of slow things down and put us in that spot. And that connects to the other thing that Chad said that I wanted to kind of work off of. And he said, let me take you into Moses' psyche. And I think Chad's done a great job of taking us into the perspective of Moses as he builds his relationship with God and as he takes on this task that God has for him. A difficult task is leading people through this amazing, epic level story. And I wanted to flip it because we are talking about an entire nation. And really that entire nation is made up of ordinary people, much like us. I mean, we're not Moses. I'm not Moses, and we're not him. We're not having that experience. So I thought it'd be good to kind of slow down and ask the question, what would the ordinary Israelite be thinking, be faced with in particular parts of the story? And I actually had about 5 or 6 that I wanted to talk about, but that would take way too long, and I didn't have enough time to write it up this week. So what I ended up doing was focusing on 2 specific places back in the story, and then I'll tell you guys what the other ones were that I thought of and kind of talk a little bit about that at the end. But the first place that I would like to slow down and focus on the experience of the ordinary Israelite is back, all the way back, this is going to feel like forever ago, in chapter 5. Chapter 5, the ordinary Israelite was a slave. Still a slave, making bricks for Pharaoh every morning. Sun rises over the place where their ancestors came to escape drought, to survive. We know this because the history of the Bible, that's where the history goes back to. And this is the place where they have become a nation or generations of the people have left their homes to spend every day to spend their time out under the sun, sinking their arms up to the elbow to play in water from the Nile, mixing in the straw from Egyptian fields, slopping great handfuls of mud into a mold, and looking up at the end of the day to find row after row after row of sun-baked bricks, possibly numbering over 1,000. I researched this a little bit, and I found out that they say a modern brickmaker who used the ancient methods can make 1,000 to 2,000 a day, which sounds kind of crazy, but that's what they're doing. That's their entire day is that repeated motion: mix, mold, bake, mix, mold, bake. That's the everyday Israelites experience back then. Up to 1,000. I went with the low end of the estimate because 2,000 just sounds crazy. 1,000 just sounds a little bit crazy. And that's all for the construction of the homes of the citizens of Egypt. So they're working for the empire. Generations have done this. They're fortifying and expanding this nation, this empire. Mud was everywhere. Basically, the land of Egypt was caked on their clothes, their faces, and their hair. Imagine them wiping the sweat from the brow and smearing mud all over their face. Under their fingernails, caked on their skin at the end of the day. They would go home. They would eat beaten bread to fuel tomorrow's work. It's the same thing they did today. Mix, mold, and bake. That would come up again tomorrow. They would lie down and groan because of their slavery. They would just be so tired of this existence. Look over to their sons and daughters and cry out to God for rescue. They would cry out that their sons and daughters wouldn't have their lives defined by making thousands of bricks. But they weren't necessarily hopeful about it. They just wanted it to end, but they didn't know if it would. And then the next day, they would go make 1,000 bricks, and the next day, they would make 1,000 bricks, and that would keep going. And that is the life of the everyday Israelite. And then enter Moses. So for us, he's this great big, well-known character or figure in biblical history. For them, he's this new guy who shows up and talks to the elders. He tells them who he is, that he's returning, that he was one of them, the Egyptians. He was raised as one of them, but he's actually one of us. He is an Israelite, not necessarily ordinary, but he is one of us, in that he has this story about God speaking to him in the wilderness. He says something about this bush that burned but didn't, and people are probably kind of amazed by that because we take it as kind of for granted, especially if you grew up and heard this story a lot. But then that's the first time they're hearing it. That would be awe-inspiring, yet probably strange. Some of them probably didn't believe it. Others of them were probably spiking with hope. So this Moses guy comes up, and in case they didn't believe it, I looked to do this, to kind of look at the story, I looked through the chapters, and it talks about Moses doing signs in front of the people. So Chad talked about the signs that God showed him out in the desert, and then it says he did those in the sight of the people. He stood up in front of them and threw his staff on the ground. And there they would see it writhe and slither and hiss. And before it does harms anyone, he reaches down and he grabs it by the tail, and it's his staff again. And that would be kind of amazing to see a man stand up and do that. He tucks his hand inside his cloak, pulls it out again, and it's misshapen and white and covered in sores. That's what they would see. And then he tucks it in again and removes the helping hand. And then he takes a bowl of water from the Nile and pours it on the ground, and there it would glisten red in the sun, and all the people would see this. And at this point, they're probably getting pretty excited, because that's an amazing set of events to see. This guy stands up, tells you he's come with God's mission to deliver your people, and then transforms a staff into a snake, back into a staff again. He has a leper's hand, and he turns water into blood, or at least that's what it looks like from their perspective. So they're getting excited. They're probably at that moment looking at those same sons and daughters and thinking, hey, maybe this is going to change. Maybe things are not going to be like they were. Maybe they're not going to have to make thousands of bricks, and that would be their life's work, thousands of bricks for this other empire. They're probably getting pretty excited, and they do bow their heads, they worship Yahweh, hopeful what would happen when Moses goes to Pharaoh to tell Pharaoh about what he told them. So they hoped for no more bricks, and they got no more straw. The brick makers used straw to make the Egyptian bricks strong, to keep them from cracking, to keep the building standing. They took straw from the piles their masters had provided and mixed it in with the clay. But now, on the next morning, they show up to work, and there's no piles of straw. It's not there. They heard that Moses was going to go talk to Pharaoh, and things were supposed to be great. They weren't supposed to be slaves anymore, and now they're showing up like, wait, where's the straw? What's going on? And they hear their masters tell them, we expect the same amount of bricks. We expect the same rows and rows and rows, but you don't get the straw. You have to go get it. And their foremen, the Israelite leaders, those with the responsibility of leading the work crews, would look at them and basically say, Pharaoh said no more straw, but he didn't change the number of bricks that we have to make. And I imagine those foremen were pretty scared. I imagine the Israelites looking at them could see fear in their eyes. I mean, there's no possible way they can make the same number of bricks. It's not going to happen, yet that's the expectation. So now, before they could mix the clay and water of the Nile with straw to make bricks, they had to venture out into the fields to pick up straw for themselves. Rows and rows and rows of stalks, the stubble of crops cut down at harvest, had to be collected before they could start on their 1,000 bricks. So here they are out in the sun, the ordinary Israelite, bending over, snatching up pieces of straw here and there, scraping their fingers on the ground, bending again and again, back getting sore, knowing that 1,000 bricks is what is coming next, as opposed to just what their workday is. And I imagine they would hold a growing supply in one hand, and maybe the wind comes up and blows some away, and then they're watching, that's work they have to do again, they have to go pick that up. So this is just getting worse and worse. And no matter what, the scavenged straw would not be enough to make bricks, or make enough bricks to meet their quota. And after a couple of days of missing piles of straw, trips out to the fields, late starts at mixing the clay and the water, fewer and fewer rows of bricks, the Egyptian taskmasters would take the foremen, they just laid into them. They're beating them, they're bruising them, they're breaking their skin, and they're mockingly asking, like, why aren't you guys making enough bricks? What's wrong? You've been making bricks for so long. Why can't you do it? Why can't you do it? And they're just breaking the leaders of the people. And so those beaten foremen, imagine still with black eyes and cuts and broken bones and whatever else happened to them, went to Pharaoh, and they complained. They said this is impossible, and Pharaoh doesn't budge. So all they can do is go back to the people and say, he won't give us straw, and he's not changing his demand. So the foremen also go to Moses next. And at this point, they're talking to this man with the mission, the guy who did the miraculous signs, and asks, why did you come here? Why are you doing this? You said you would deliver us, but all it looks like to them is that it's going to end them. That's it for their people, because they're going to be beaten, they're going to be worked to death. They don't see anything changing, and all they feel is the squeeze of the powerful empire that has them. And I want to pause right here, and it's kind of a difficult place in the story for us to pause because we know the arc, we know what happens. But I think it's important to pause here because I think we've been here too. I think to gain anything from exploring the ordinary experience, from slowing down and thinking about the details of an ordinary Israelite's life, I think you have to be willing to ask some questions about our own when they feel an awful lot like those did. So for us, when have circumstances seemed too much to bear? And I know this is kind of sounds like a simple question, but I think it's important to sit and reflect and say, when has it been like this? When has it felt like, first my life consists of making bricks, and then after that it consists of, I have to find the straw and then make the bricks. And I think it's important to see like this, look back on your life and say, when has it just seemed like this is too much? And then, I think what is the most devastating part of this for the ordinary Israelite is addressed by this next question. When have you assumed life would improve only to watch it grow more difficult? There's so much hope in those signs. There's so much belief that things will change, and then they do, and they get horrendously worse. So I think it's important to look and say, and honestly look at our own lives and say, when have I been in that spot where I thought, this isn't even getting better, it's just getting worse, and I can't handle this. And then, on top of that, what have you seen that can remind you in these difficult times that God does not change and that these difficult circumstances are not permanent. And that's where our chronological advantage comes back in. And we know it's not permanent. We know that Israel gets out of slavery. But it's more difficult to say that to ourselves, because what we see and sense and everything around us is just telling us that life is going to continue to be difficult, and it may even get worse after this. And that's what they saw. That's what they felt. That's what their day was like. Hours and hours of thinking, this is just getting worse. And they kind of set aside those signs. They didn't think about the staff and the hand and the bowl of water that they saw God transform. They set those things aside. So I think just as much as you reflect on when has it been really difficult, apart from that, reflect on what has God done in your life? What have you seen Him do that can remind you that this isn't going to change? And you can kind of take hope in that. I think off of that question, you can look at the stories of those around you. When has God come through for other people? When has their difficult circumstance turned into something that is manageable, even joyful? And you can go back to stories like this and think about the fact that it does get really bad, but then it changes and it's something that they wanted all along, the freedom from slavery, because they thought it would end them. And honestly, sometimes we look at life and like, this is going to be the end of me. I can't handle this. But there's a verse at the end of chapter 12. I know I said I was in chapter 5, but skipping to the end of chapter 12. This is sort of the end of the first part. If you broke Exodus up into smaller pieces, this is the end of the first part. When we got to chapter 12, I remember sitting and reading the last verse over and over, and that is Exodus 12:51. And I was just reflecting on the gravity of this situation at that time. It says, on that very day, the Lord brought the people of Israel out of the land of Egypt by their hosts. And it seems like such a simple verse, and I think we expect it with this story. I think you say, well, they're not going to be slaves forever, we know that. But to just reflect on the fact that they had incredibly difficult lives that they thought were getting worse, and then there's evidence here. God saves, God redeems, God delivers. You can take part in that. You can reflect on the fact that God did what He said He would do, and that the ordinary Israelite now is not a slave, not making bricks. Their life is not defined by those rows and rows and rows. And they don't have to scour for straw. Those times are over and done. And just to jump ahead to the New Testament, kind of connected to further ideas there, speaking in difficult times to those who follow Him, speaking of a difficult future to those who would go on without Him physically present, Jesus tells His disciples something very similar that connects to that idea. He says, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. I think it's a beautiful thing that Jesus Himself just owns up and says, life is going to be difficult, you're going to have troubles, but you can have peace in me, take trust in me, I have overcome. Because a lot of times, I imagine that the Israelite, the ordinary Israelite, felt overcome by their quota of bricks, by the field they needed to scour, by the hot sun. Just it was too much. They could not handle it. But those times did not overcome them. Jesus says the world will not overcome us. He has overcome the world. And I think it's a good thing to finally kind of rest in that and to really meditate on the fact that Jesus is taking care of things. God proved it a long time ago. We shouldn't forget that. Just like the Israelites should not have forgotten that Moses did those signs, even though things got worse, we should not forget what Jesus said as well. Okay, so the other place that I wanted to kind of hang out in the story is further on in the story. It's chapter 16. So it's after the escape. We jump ahead. In the first place I wanted to pause, I wanted to think about the ordinary Israelite and their life as a slave, a brickmaker. This is the ordinary Israelite as a nomad, as someone wandering the wilderness. They have escaped, they're free, and now they've replaced the groaning in Egypt with grumbling in the wilderness of sin. And the experience of the ordinary Israelite back in Egypt, what they are now thinking of when they're looking back to their time as slaves, and back in chapter 5, When they're in the wilderness, it seems very different. They're remembering it very differently than how it happened. And instead of remembering being covered in that Nile mud, searching Egyptian fields for straw to make rows and rows of bricks, the memory shifts to the ample supply of meat and bread they had as slaves. They think, I was fed, I was full. Yeah, I was tired, but they made sure I had food. And I feel like it's a side note to say, of course they did. They wanted you to work the next day. But that's not what they were thinking through. They were thinking, I was surviving. I had plenty to eat. So here in the wilderness, every step is a tired reminder of hunger, not freedom. The landscape looks foreign and uninviting. And this is the people that grew up in Egypt. That was their home as much as they were foreigners there. That's where they grew. That's what they knew. What they grew up doing, knowing. And the wilderness there just stretches on. They don't see the end. They don't know where they're going. All they see is this place they don't know and that is not bringing them food. And I imagine one of the more philosophically inclined ordinary Israelites at this point would kind of pipe up and say, as they're walking along the roads, just to whoever happens to be around, they're asking the question, wouldn't it have been better to live back in Egypt than to die out here, in this road, in this wilderness? We're hungry. We were fed. And so this probably was a sentiment that started to trickle through the people. The ordinary people pick up on this. They're like, yeah, it would have been better to live back then. This was good food that we had. We were not even close to hungry. And here, we have nothing. My stomach hurts right now as I'm walking. I'm getting fatigued. I just want some food. So this is, not what they signed up for. They are discontent. And Aaron comes to all of them. And I think it's funny, I imagine Aaron showing up and talking to all of them, and someone would be like, he knows we were upset. He knows he's going to say something about it. And then he says that God has heard their grumbling. So not just Aaron knows, but God himself knows. And then this cloud shows up. Out in the wilderness, this cloud, bright, shiny cloud, which the Bible talks about as God's glory, but really, if you're just the ordinary Israelite, you're like, whoa, what is that? What's going on? And then Moses steps up and has this announcement. There's going to be meat tonight, and then there's going to be bread tomorrow for breakfast, which is very exciting. It's like way better than the free continental breakfast at a hotel. So they're changing, they're grumbling, they're probably pretty excited. God heard them reminiscing about meat and bread in Egypt. And Moses is now saying that Yahweh is going to provide meat and bread out in the wilderness, specifically so that they will know Yahweh is their God. That's what he tells them. So that's their process to do that. And they probably have that anticipation of a coming meal. For us, it would probably be like waiting to eat on Thanksgiving or Christmas morning. Like, this is going to be so good. And that's what they're thinking, except they have been a long time without food, and we were just since breakfast on those holidays. And then just imagine slowing this down, thinking about what would have actually happened. The sound of rushing wind, this great black cloud showing up. They don't know what it is. It moves towards the camp, and then it just thud, thud, thud everywhere. Thousands of them, and it's quail. They go out and they figure out there's quail that just fell from the sky, a lot of it, for us. And they were really excited. So that night, they slept full and rested. They were satisfied. They had gathered birds from the ground, plucked their feathers, collected the dry brush from the wilderness, and roasted their meals over crackling fires. Anybody who's been camping and has cooked over a fire knows that is a great way to cook. And so that's the whole camp is doing that. They ate and they ate. Some of them, I imagine, were quiet in awe of what they just saw, of what that great cloud of food came, of what they're tasting now. Some were probably loud, talking about how Yahweh always comes through, and they knew it. He does it in the strangest of ways, though. And he always does such surprising things with animals falling from the sky. The people talk about plagues, and that makes them think of their time back in Egypt again. And they're like, wow, those plagues were pretty crazy. And about what they saw happen back in Egypt to their former masters. And they were thankful that this food is for fuel for travel, not for work. They could look up into the sky and see the stars, the same uncountable stars that God used to help Abraham understand how numerous their nation would be someday. They could wonder what the bread would be like in the morning. imagining loaves falling from the sky, probably just like the great black cloud, and this time it's a great brown cloud of loaves of bread falling. I mean, what else would they think of? It's their point of reference. I really imagine the ordinary Israelite looking out into the wilderness and this mirage of piles of bread, loaves of bread out there. And so in the morning, I imagine, for us, it's that Christmas morning when you're a kid feeling, this is going to be an amazing day, I have to get up, I have to get up. So they burst out of their tents, as the sun is rising, anxious to find the bread God promised. And then, pausing right here, this would be a really weird moment, because based on the description you have, they probably were disappointed a little bit. They're like, where's the bread? I don't see any piles of bread. There are no loaves of bread out in the wilderness. I don't understand. So maybe there's this, heart-dropping kind of moment. The same thing happened before. Like, oh, we've been through this. We're supposed to get better. Now they're getting worse. There's no bread. So maybe they go out into the wilderness. Maybe it's further away. They have to go find it. And one of them says, frost. There's frost on the ground. And, they're kind of thinking, hey, it was cool in the desert last night, but not cold enough for frost. So what is this? And everyone around them is saying, what is it? What is it? What is it? Which that's Manna's translation to English. So if we were out there, we would call it, what is it? And they looked down at their feet, and they saw flakes on their sandals, this little strange fine substance. They're curious about what this is, and an answer starts to trickle through that comes from Moses. And all the people are saying, Moses is saying that this is the bread. This is what God, Yahweh sent us. And Moses said we're supposed to gather enough for everyone in our tent to eat. And then they're probably celebrating at that point. They're like, sweet, meat last night, bread this morning, here we go. And so instead of bending down to gather pieces of straw, now the ordinary, everyday Israelite is bending down to gather as much of this white, flaky, small seed stuff that you can find off of the grasses, the bushes, the rocks, the ground itself. And they probably were like, what does this taste like? And so one, the brave one, whoever is willing to eat it first, probably scoops some up and sticks a finger in his mouth. He's like, honey! And they're all really excited because they can't go to the store and buy honey. You have to kind of go to where the bees make it back in. And it's a big deal. Chad talked about how that would have been literally the most decadent thing any of them had tasted. So it was a really exciting moment. So yeah, at first they were like, where's the piles of bread? And now they're like, this honey frost stuff is really good, and we can have as much as we want, so let's go. So they gather it, they take it back. And Moses said something crazy to them. They're like, okay, we haven't had food for a while, we're pretty hungry, but Moses said we're only supposed to gather enough for today, and we're not supposed to let these sit overnight. And he says that God's going to do this again. That tomorrow morning, this bread, frost, honey stuff is going to be out on the ground, and we're going to do this all over again. And then we're going to do it the day after that. And then the day before the Sabbath, we get to gather 2 days worth, so we can get a day off. The ordinary Israelite has gone from a life of slavery, 1,000 bricks today, 1,000 bricks tomorrow, if you don't do it, you're in big trouble, to a mandated day off, which I imagine would be amazing. So they eat honey 6 days of the week, or gather honey and bread the 6 days of the week, and they get to eat it the next day, but they don't have to do anything. They don't have to work. So they probably haven't experienced this very much, and they're probably enjoying it quite a bit. And I think the exploration of this part of the ordinary Israelites' experience leads to discovery, their discovery. I actually had a lot of fun when I was thinking through this, because I was like, man, they would have just encountered so much they didn't expect that would have been really surprising and really positive for them. And celebration. I'm sure this was full of conviviality. We talk about that a lot. The idea that they're sharing community around meals. Picture that fire time. Picture being out in the desert with your friends, gathering up this honey frost, and knowing that you're going to be fed for the day and tomorrow and the next day, and you don't have to be a slave, but you still get to eat. They got what they asked for, rescue from slavery, and they very quickly focused on the wrong details in their memories. They didn't think back and say, God brought us out of this. They kind of thought God brought us into this, and what are we doing? But they lost some of those, the idea of the overall mission that Moses came to talk about, going to the promised land. They grumbled because they couldn't see food right in front of them, instead of just thinking about how, wait, okay, God just got us out of Egypt. The entire nation, all of us, ordinary Israelites, God got us out of slavery from a nation that could really use the manpower. It wasn't like they were like, you know what, we have enough slaves, you guys just go. God accomplished a great thing in freeing their nation, but they weren't thinking about that, and they didn't just pause and say, God, we're hungry, can we eat? Simple, that's it. But I think once that started to happen, they were really happy. They started to enjoy their freedom. They started to understand who God is a little bit more. And so I want to take some questions that we can use to compare our lives in this part of the ordinary Israelites experience. The first one is, when has God provided? So just like earlier, I asked you to reflect on when has life been just too much to bear. Now, I really think it's a good thing to sit down and reflect. When are the times that God has given me what I need, given me more than what I need, given me what my family needs, given me what my people, my community, my nation needs? And then on top of that, going back to the idea of the senses, that we are limited to that, what evidence of his provision, of that time of provision or current time of provision, what evidence is right in front of you? And I think it was really cool as I thought about what the ordinary Israelite would have thought about as they are going out into the wilderness to look for bread. I never thought about the fact that they probably didn't imagine frost that they would eat, tiny seeds, tiny flakes. That's not probably what their expectation was. But that's what it was. It was right in front of them. It took a little while to see. And I think it's important that we pause and say, what is there in my life right now that shows that God has provided? And is it small? Is it perhaps difficult to see? Is it something you need to look for and really, really concentrate on and say, okay, what is connected to what God has done for me? And all the things that I own and all the things that I do and all the people I know, what is connected to what God has done for me? Does it show up every day? This one can be kind of difficult, and I want to jump ahead to a verse that addresses this in their experience too. Does it show up every day? Is it still a reminder of God's provision? I think what's important to know is I paused here because it's this cool moment in the story when the ordinary Israelite would have been really excited. So this is day one of manna. And then day two comes, and I'm sure they're like, this happened again. God is real. He can be believed. Day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, when they didn't have to gather it, they get up in the morning, and they're like, hey, it's still here. The other day, some people kept it, and it stunk, and it got worms in it, but it didn't happen today. So God can even change what happens with his food. So he's really powerful. This is crazy. We're going to be provided for even when we don't gather on that day. But that's the first week or so. And then week 2, week 3, on through Exodus 16:35 says, the people of Israel ate the manna 40 years until they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna until they came to the border of the land of Canaan. So week 52 was probably a little bit different than week 2. Day 5,336 was probably a little less exciting than day 1. But that doesn't mean God changed providing or stopped, changed who he was and stopped providing. He did exactly what he said he would do. He's feeding them. He's continuing to feed them. He's sustaining his people. They are alive, and they still are not slaves. So it's important to remember that as exciting as it was on day 1, what God did on day 1 continued and didn't change. And perhaps it might be something for us to reflect on and say, okay, what was I really excited about when it first happened? And now it's just life. Now it even might be the condition I felt like it sort of feels like the slavery. That it's, I've allowed it to change instead of saying, God gave me this. What are you looking at in your life that you can say, God has continually provided over a long time, instead of being bored with it, of saying, I wish we would spice it up a little. I want some more variety. That's how we do it in America. We change things all the time. Just reminding that, or looking back and thinking, reflecting on that constant presence of a good God who sustains, without needing to be all fireworks and amazing, just the consistency. So, those are the two places that I ended up focusing on. I thought there were some connections there. One sort of on the difficult side, one on the really positive, fun side. I think this would be a good thing. Both of those are good things for you to talk about in community groups and reflect on at your dinner table with your family. Really talk about these things. What does your ordinary story look like compared to the ordinary Israelite in both cases? There were some others that I really thought about jumping into. I just didn't quite have time to do that. So I thought I would extend those invitations for you to further explore the life of the ordinary Israelite. And there's so many of them in the story. Exodus is this grand, epic story, but I think that what we skip over sometimes is all the opportunities that we have to pause and think about the ordinary moments tucked into that story that would be closer to what we're experiencing. So just throwing a few out, just imagine what it would have been like someone taking steps across the Red Sea, the bottom of it, the dry bottom, with a wall of water left and right. You're crossing it step by step with your family, you're watching your kids, making sure they don't run into the sea. I'm sure some little kids put a speaker in it. Some kids do. Some adults probably do. Imagine someone with a stage tunic from where Moses threw blood onto the people. The blood is still there. Blood is still there. You wash it. Blood is still there. And what does that remind them of? What does that blood spot call to mind? When Moses was talking, when Moses threw that out on the crowd, that moment, what does that symbolize in terms of what they learn later about what they need to do with the law, how that's supposed to define their culture, their relationship, their ability to relate to God? Imagine someone assigned to weave goat hair together to make the tent for God's house. I think it's kind of a strange thing. You're weaving goat hair. Goats aren't all that hairy, so that would take a lot of time. And imagine, you're not one of the ones who said, assigned to one of the skill jobs, a skill position. Embroidering the Holy of Holies cherub design goes to this guy over here, and you get goat hair. Just imagine that, and then imagine watching everybody, watching all the people doing their jobs, and watching things get finished. And suddenly this thing is real, and there's all the team of goat hair weavers is really excited about putting their panel together and watching it go up. And you look at that and you're like, I helped with that. I helped with God's house. So going from the probable disappointment of goat hair weaving, I don't know, maybe some of you are really excited about that, to the possible elation of seeing, God invited you to be a part of this. He didn't just command you to do this weird job, but you saw how you were involved in the community, making this thing happen as a part of bringing God's glory to the front. And the most recent one that we talked about, which I really wanted to focus on this one, I just didn't have time. I think there's a lot of interesting things you could think about, is someone contemplating whether or not to take off a gold earring and give it to Aaron to make their calf. They'd probably reach up and feel it. I don't know. I don't know if I believe this is what we should do, but everybody's doing it. That guy over there is really mad and really excited about this calf thing. He's upset about Yahweh, and if I don't do it, he'll yell at me. So, and what's their decision? What do they do? How do they feel about taking part in that? As the situation plays out, when Moses comes down off the mountain and is so angry that he makes them eat that, he grounds it up and they drink the water. And that gold earring that they gave, now they're drinking it as this symbolic gesture of what Moses and God think about the fact that they made this calf. I think there's a lot of places you can camp out like this. Again, I said I'm an English teacher. I think about life in story, and I thought it would be a good thing to kind of invite you guys into that. The exploration of the ordinary Israelite, I think, is something that is worthwhile because the story moves pretty quickly. But there are plenty of stops where you can stop and wonder what the ordinary Israelite was seeing and hearing. And again, that sensory thing. What were they seeing? What were they hearing? They don't know what's next in the story. They only know what's now and what God has told them. Do they choose to believe that or not, based on what they see and hear? Think about what they were thinking and feeling. Might help you reflect on some situations that you've been in, to see in the midst of a story how they might be feeling, and then think about, okay, how does this wrap up? What happens? How can I gain some wisdom from that? Think about what decisions they had to make for themselves, for their family. What questions would they choose to answer with their current circumstances, what they see around them, or with who Yahweh had shown and said himself to be. I think doing this will help us live our ordinary lives with excellence, because that's what we have. It will help us live with perseverance, and it will help us follow God where he would have us go. Remembering that we too are a part of an epic story on an ordinary scale, despite the difficulties along the way.